Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Nina Guilbeault about The Good Eater, a vegan search for the future of food. To research the book, she traveled the world, meeting with innovators, farmers, and food experts. She offers a vision for a future where food is produced and consumed in a way that prioritizes human and planetary well-being. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Nina Guilbeault is a sociologist, author, and educator. She's the co-founder of Plant Futures, a nonprofit affiliated with UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, and she has served as a consultant to major food brands. Nina, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Well, before we dig into some details in this book, tell us about your motivation behind wanting to examine the food chain and how your own journey in veganism shaped your perspectives.
Well, I'm the person that you would least expect to be vegan. I actually was born in Eastern Europe, and I grew up eating lots of meat and dairy. My origins are Russian, Ukrainian, and Jewish, and so we ate a lot of meat and dairy growing up. But I grew up with my grandfather, and actually when I was in graduate school at Harvard University, he became ill with cancer and other chronic diseases, and his early death from those diseases actually inspired me to look at the link between diet and disease, something that I had never done before. And I was really quite shocked at what I found. I had no idea that for many years, many nutritional studies had shown that actually following a plant-based diet, a majority plant-based diet, and kind of a more wholesome whole foods diet could actually not only prevent but reverse disease. So I had been vegetarian for a while before that, but it wasn't a big part of my identity at all. And it's only when my grandfather passed early on that inspired me to look at the link. And then I also discovered the ethical implications of what we eat, the environmental implications. And at that point, I realized that actually our food chain is, it's obscured by design. We actually have very little sense of how our food comes to our plate. And that's really what started my own journey.
And let's talk a bit about the food chain, because there are obviously problems about the food chain or with the food chain, as you point out in the book. We don't have enough food to go around, or at least it's not distributed properly. So there are a lot of people who don't have food. And then we have junk food. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about the problems you see with the food chain and how, if most people adopted a plant-based diet, it would solve those problems.
Yes, exactly. When I started actually looking and peeling back the curtain, so to speak, on the food system, I discovered that actually, food access is a big issue. In fact, in the world, we produce enough food to grow and actually feed a growing world population, but most of that food that we grow is actually fed to farmed animals. So we grow soy and corn and wheat, and even though we could be growing that for humans, it's actually fed to farm animals. And so we waste a lot of the kind of caloric potential of food. And so, yes, we have these incredibly incredible inequality in this country and around the world, where some people have access to lots of fresh produce and vegetables and meat 3 times a day. And some people have access only to junk food because they're basically living in what we'd call food deserts, where they actually can't even walk to a grocery store and get fresh produce. And in a way, a plant-based diet, or just moving toward a plant-based diet, is one of the solutions to that problem, because essentially it provides more nutrition, first of all, than the standard American diet. But also, if more people were to eat more plants and less meat, we'd actually be able to feed more people. We wouldn't be wasting that food on, feeding it through farmed animals. So that's something that most people aren't aware of, actually.
Another thing you point out at the beginning of your book is veganism, where not that many years ago was something that not many people even knew about. But it's become more and more mainstream, at least in people being aware of it. So what happened? How did we have that transition for veganism?
And that's really the question that started this book journey for me, is really this cultural transformation. Like, I am one of those people, I never thought I would ever adopt a plant-based diet, that I would identify as vegan. I always associated with kind of animal rights activists, like protesters you see on the street. We often think of people for the ethical treatment of animals, PETA videos and undercover footage. And so I I just really didn't identify with this movement. But in the last 5 to 10 years, as you point out, it's really become much more mainstream. So we see it on social media, documentaries exposing the cruelties of factory farming and fishing industries, and then also the knowledge about the plant-based diet. So a lot of people wouldn't, I think a lot of people actually are aware of the fact that a plant-based diet is healthy. It's just that there are kind of psychological and cultural barriers toward adopting it. And what happened is that a new set of cultural entrepreneurs is what I call them. They're really cultural transformers who popularized it. So that includes athletes who have really normalized the fact that a plant-based diet can be very helpful for athletics and performance, but also doctors and researchers that have shown us the research on a plant-based diet. The environmental effects, I think a lot of people are aware of the fact that meat has an outsized impact on the environment. And so all these cultural currents coming together, I think, have raised the consciousness. We're still in what I would call the kind of early adopter phase. So people are aware of these facts, but the vast majority of the population still isn't actually following this kind of lifestyle.
Well, there's a lot in this book, and obviously we're not going to be able to talk about all of it. So before we talk about a few more specifics, give us a brief overview here. What are readers going to find?
So The Good Eater is it's a story of the cultural transformation of veganism from essentially a niche subculture into a mainstream movement. But it also turned out to be quite a personal account of my own journey to understand the answer to this question at the very heart of the book, which is there an ethical way to eat? And in a sense, that question, which seems to be quite obvious. Of course, there must be an ethical way to eat, but in fact, the food system is very, very complex. So even adopting a plant-based diet is only the start, not the end of a journey toward a more conscious way of eating. And so that's what the book is about. I cover this topic all the way from looking at the ancient history of eating a diet without any animal products. This is actually an ancient movement, through the animal rights movement of the 1970s. And into the present, where veganism has become a lifestyle movement. It's much more capitalistic. We see these products coming out of Silicon Valley and investors putting in money into this movement. And then I also look at the critics, the regenerative agriculturists, the people who advocate for an alternative system, which is a grass-fed beef kind of food system. And I look at the radical history of veganism as well in the African diaspora around the world. And so really I look at this question of how to eat from many different angles. And I really encourage the reader to consider for themselves what are their values and what is guiding their food choices. And really what I'd love for readers to take away from this book is to really have more awareness and consciousness around what is actually on their plate, because we really are literally and figuratively what we eat. And Wendell Berry, who's a well-known poet and farmer and novelist, he is famous for saying eating is an agricultural act. But I also believe that eating is a political, a social act, environmental act, and also a spiritual act. I really believe that what we eat is the most profound relationship that we can have with our bodies, with the earth, with other beings. And that's really what the book is about.
And as you point out in the book, not everyone is going to want to adopt a vegan diet. But if more people work toward a plant-based diet, it would help the planet.
Absolutely. I think in veganism, but also in general in the food movement, there's too much emphasis on perfectionism and really joining a particular movement and adopting a particular identity. And as I say, I am vegan personally for philosophical reasons, but it'd be much more effective if many of us shifted toward a plant-based diet, whether or not it was entirely vegan, than if only a small proportion of us stayed vegan. So I really believe in a kind of harm reduction, vast meat reduction approach. So whether that means eating meat once a week on Sundays, which is, by the way, how we used to eat. Actually, meat used to be a special occasion food. We would have it around the dinner table on Sunday night. And for the most part, we ate more of a plant-based diet. And so really, I'm advocating for a reversal in history, because really this idea that we eat meat, dairy, eggs 3 times a day is really an artifact only of the last 50 to 70 years. So I really just advocate for a return to that. And for listeners and readers, I really just say, whatever that might look like, whether it's vegan on the weekends, vegan during the day, or, vegan at home and then not vegan when you travel, I really emphasize a really significant reduction.
I'm talking with Nina Guilbeault about The Good Eater, a vegan search for the future of food. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you appreciate this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll know when I post new interviews. And thank you. You spent years researching this book, and you talked with farmers, you talked with entrepreneurs and scientists. What were some of the most innovative and you think positive developments you're seeing in terms of food and particularly plant-based foods?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I've been working on this topic actually for more than a decade, almost a decade actually, because it started in my graduate work as well at Harvard University before I wrote the book. So I've interviewed over 150 people in this movement, all different factions of the movement. And, it's interesting because at first what I was really excited about are these innovative plant-based products that are coming out of Silicon Valley, things like Beyond Meat. And I think those products do have a role in the transition. For some people, just meat is so significant in terms of the evolutionary part that the part that it's played in our evolutionary history, and also in terms of its cultural status. And so for people who are really, for whom food is very nostalgic, for who grew up eating meat, I think these products, which are made of peas and soy and wheat, but resemble meat, I think they can be really central. That's what I was really kind of excited about in the beginning of my journey. But over time, I also saw some of the challenges and problems with those solutions. And I became much more excited about people who are working at the intersection of regenerative agriculture and also veganism. And essentially that way of farming is a more conscious way of farming, where the idea is, that we actually replenish the land as we farm rather than kind of exploit it, which is something that I didn't know much about actually when I started working on this topic. And so now I'm just much more excited about people who are working locally and regeneratively to grow food. And that's something that when I started my journey, a lot of the time people in that movement critique vegans, but I really think that we can have a kind of beautiful marriage between those movements. And so that's one of the things I also talk about in the book.
One of the things that happens with some of these products that are plant-based or try to imitate meat is they end up being very processed. And if you're trying to avoid processed foods, then that's a negative factor of those products.
Absolutely. But I also try to remind people that it's worth remembering what they're compared to, because the meat we think, in the grocery store that we think is not processed, actually, it most of the time is as well. It's dyed, it's, processed with chemicals and, to retain freshness. So factory farmed animal products are also, I would consider them to be a processed food. And I think they would be by nutritionists. But you're right that plant-based products, for the most part, they are borrowing from what I would call the fast food playbook. And I think sometimes there's this health halo that surrounds plant-based products. I don't think they should be thought of as a health food. I think they should be thought of as an alternative to the current system that we're in. I sometimes refer to them as absurd solutions to absurd problems, because the problems they're solving really are absurd in terms of how we actually produce meat, dairy, and eggs. But in themselves, I mean, the idea of turning wheat or soy into these realistic meat-like substances is a strange innovation, but it's also not a new one, actually. It's been around for many, many centuries, actually, that we've been trying to produce meat-like substances. So I would say, personally, they're off my plate, but I think for people who really are quite attached to those products, I think they are a better alternative.
Let's talk a bit about the future of food, because that's part of what this book is about. In your perfect world, how do you envision the future of food and sort of the role that veganism plays in that world?
Well, what I would hope would happen is a kind of, ironically, the future of food, I would hope, would look more like the past of food, where Meat, dairy, and eggs are just simply not the cornerstone of our diet, of the Western diet, and junk food and processed food is not, an entire food category, which it really is in this country. But we actually revert back to really being inspired by the culinary legacies of our history and rediscovering the flavors and textures and foods of every world cuisine. And in my perfect world, we would all eat, fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes that are regeneratively grown and are mostly through local food chains, because actually those can support a varied diet. But we also live in a world where we have respect for the seasons, the fact that we live on an earth with different climates. And of course, with climate change in particular, there has to be more consciousness around the fact that our climate is changing and our food system has to adapt. And we used to live in a world where we had access to kind of heritage grains and legumes. And now we live in this very monoculture crop system that, feeds animals on factory farms. And then we, go to the grocery store and we have no sense of really how that food got to our plate. So I think more consciousness around that. And I would love if I had children or grandchildren, if one day they would say, did we really used to eat that much meat? Did we really used to think that it was, that it was morally accepted to slaughter this many animals and this many aquatic creatures? And that I would actually be able to say that, this was a dark period in a sense in our cultural and culinary history. That's what I would love. I mean, being more of a realist, I know that, change is hard. I mean, as a sociologist, I know there are many psychological and cultural barriers against that, but I'm doing my part that I can, which is this part of a storyteller.
And if just more people would adopt a plant-based diet, even if it's not full-time, but as you pointed out, at least as a larger part of their diet, that's a move in the right direction.
Absolutely. And there's actually research to show that if the vast majority of the population were to adopt a mostly plant-based diet, we could actually avert climate catastrophe.
Well, there's so much more in this book that we haven't had a chance to talk about. What would you say are a few of the key takeaways that you want readers to learn from your book?
Well, one is that, I feel like people often think that a plant-based diet is very complicated, like that there's a huge learning curve to adopting it. And there's also fears around protein deficiency. I often get asked, like, how do you get enough protein and so on? And I really point out that there are a lot of kind of dietary misconceptions, and the protein myth being one of them. And it's this idea that actually it's quite hard not to get enough protein if you get enough calories in the diet. And if anything, what our diets are mostly missing are fiber and different types of nutrients. So often the food industry will say, this product has antioxidants or this other product has fiber. And really, if we just eat a wholesome, whole foods, plant-based diet, we will get enough of those nutrients. So I think kind of emphasizing what my mentor, Michael Pollan, has said for a long time, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So really focusing on the fact that if you just fill your plate with whole fruits and vegetables and grains and legumes, you will actually get your nutritional needs met. And of course, it's important to supplement also with B12. So that's one thing. Another is that I really just want people to recognize that I think the treatment of animals on factory farms, and this is something that I think we can all agree on, whether or not we're vegan. I think it's the last kind of socially accepted moral atrocity that is happening in our lives, where it's known about, but people really just don't. There's not a kind of consciousness around that. And Paul McCartney said once that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everybody would be vegetarian, because I think all of us know that we love our pets, we love animals, we care for other non-human animals, but we don't think about the fact that like the leather we wear or the food that we eat is made of these beings. And I think we used to have, even when we ate meat in the past, we used to have a kind of reverence for the fact that a life was taken. I think now we just think of animals as commodities. Actually, it doesn't even cross our consciousness. And that's another. And of course, the environmental impact is profound. I think that's well known. And then lastly, the food justice element as well, because in following this diet, like a kind of a meat heavy standard American diet, we actually aren't aware of the fact that this creates inequality in terms of food access and who actually has access to good food. So most of the farmland that we have, we use to grow feed for animals, and we could be using that land otherwise, which is to grow food for humans, so that we could actually have better fed humans in the world as well.
Well, to learn more, the book is The Good Eater, A Vegan Search for the Future of Food by Nina Guilbeault. Nina, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Now, if you'd like to purchase The Good Eater, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.